thank you, Neil, for coming. Gizem, our anchor that you saw in the screen, she was asking me to ask you the same question I was going to ask. She's asking if we should be fine and if we should believe in these great economic data that keeps coming and believe that, you know, everything is on track. Is the economy really steaming the engine, and is it helping the stock market, or is this just a temporary thing?
It's certainly the case that if you went back to the start of the year, there was lots of concerns about the weakness of the US economy. It now seems pretty clear that all of that was down to just the exceedingly cold weather that we had here. Most of that we can chalk down to unseasonably cold winter weather. There was a strong bounce back in the second quarter. Now, the perma bears will argue that yes, that was driven to some extent by inventory build-up, and that won't continue into the third quarter, and they're right to some extent, but there's also signs in this data, and this is the really encouraging thing, that domestic demand is picking up too. So consumer spending is growing at a decent pace, but previously in the first estimate we thought that investment by businesses had contracted. Actually, in this estimate, it seems that it has actually expanded, and obviously we had strong capital goods orders yesterday. So it looks like the domestic economy is firing on, if not all cylinders, it's starting to fire, whereas previously at the start of the year it was stuttering. The
so
main
this GDP is good, you're saying?
So this is an unequivocally
business
good.
spending is going up too, but the inventory is going up as well.
So the inventory, the boost from inventories won't last into Q3, but underlying that, I think there are strong signs on the consumer sides, and there's strong signs that businesses are spending too, which is encouraging. The main area of concern and doubt, I think, from the Fed's perspective now, is what's happening overseas, and in particular what's happening in China.
Talking about Fed, this morning another Fed member spoke, Esther George, and she says that these market swings may have been a result, or they were impacted by the central bank's moves, right? It is interesting that we hear that. And yesterday, who spoke? Williams, right? The New York Fed head said that September might be off the table. As capital economics, do you think that the September is really a low probability to increase the rates?
It really depends what happens over the next week or so. If markets stabilise, and particularly some of the big turmoil in emerging markets subsides, then I think September could still be on the table. The consensus of economists and the markets are now, almost no one is expecting a September rate hike. We don't think it's out of the question. It's possible. It's even possible that they can move in October, not necessarily
October.
On the cards. There's no post FOMC press conference in October. It would make it less likely, perhaps. But I still think, if not September, then December. It's still more likely than not that they'll move at some point this year, whereas most people are now pushing back their estimates for the first move into next year.
In my other broadcastings, I do code capital economics, and I realized that, thank you, I realized that you had a close estimate to the GDP today.
Yes.
And, well, even Bloomberg economists were expecting 3.2, it came 3.7. How about the Fed's probability? Do you have some probabilities that you can give us, you can share with us for September, October, or December?
If I knew the exact probabilities, I wouldn't be sat here. I'd be a millionaire on a beach somewhere. I think it's still more likely than not that they're going to move this year, and I'd say that it's still 50-50 that could happen in September.
Oh, really? So you're not in the 28%. Everyone is throwing these probabilities. You're 50-50.
I think the problem with as soon as you start prescribing probabilities, it's the tyranny of numbers. As soon as you start giving fixed percentages and probabilities to events, I think actually that's not particularly helpful for investors. What our clients need to know is how likely is it that we see a move this year, and we think it's more likely than not that we'll see a move this year.
How about the stock market, Neil? Chinese devaluation shocked us, and then they did a liquidity injection, 28.1 billion, and this morning they're talking about another stimulus because of the parade that's coming on, the Victory Day. They want to make sure that their stock market doesn't collapse, and some insiders talked about another stimulus. Is it possible? Is it gonna? What kind of an effect is it gonna have in the stock market?
It's certainly possible, and I think almost any stimulus is going to have no impact on the stock market is the first point to make. They've tried and they've failed to prop up the stock market. It was a bubble when it was inflating, and now the bubble's collapsing. It's deflating and it's got further to run. The concern now, I think, is shifting less from the stock market and more to what's happening in the real economy, trying to give support to the real economy, make sure that we don't see that a hard landing, as people have talked about, a big collapse in growth and problems in the labour market, right, increases in unemployment, pain for households. And I think that there's a good chance they will be able to avoid that. So I think there's a good chance we'll see further stimulus. Reserve ratios and reserve requirements for banks are still very high. They can come down. Interest rates can be cut. There's room to do more on the fiscal side too, if they want to. Whether it stops the stock market from falling further, I'm sceptical. I don't think it will. I think the stock market does have further to fall. The real question from a macroeconomics perspective, and actually from the perspective of the rest of the world, is can the Chinese authorities stop the economy from crashing? And I think more likely than not they can.
You're also an expert in the emerging markets, the rest of the world, the rest of the economy, right? I was very interested in reading your report, and you said that you wouldn't be surprised if you saw a recession in Turkey within the next 2 years. What makes you say that?
Well, there's several factors. I mean, obviously the focus at the moment is on the political uncertainty and the impact that's having on the business sector and consumer confidence and so on and so forth. But I think fundamentally what's happened in Turkey is we have an economy that's been living beyond its means for a while now. It's been spending more than it produces, and it's been funding that consumption by borrowing from overseas, which was fine when Fed policy was loose and interest rates in the developed world were very low and capital flows to emerging markets were very high. Now that we're moving into an environment where that's going to change. Capital flows to emerging markets are going to, if not fall, they're going to be more subdued. The price that EMs have to pay to access that credit is going to increase. And that's going to start to squeeze emerging markets that have been living beyond their means. And Turkey's one, there are others too, like South Africa, Brazil as well. On top of that, there's been a local credit bubble that's been allowed to develop. All the talk and pressure from the government is for lower interest rates, but actually I think that the risks are in the other direction, is that monetary policy and credit policy has been kept too loose. We've seen this massive expansion of private debt, household debt, and that's potentially storing up risk for the future. And I think the combination of those two things, tighter external financing conditions coupled with domestic credit risks, that's why I think more likely than not we'll see a recession at some point in the next couple of years.
On that note, I had so many more questions to ask you, but our time is up. We need to have you back again. Okay? Thank you. Gizemciğim, sohbetimiz burada sona erdi. Neil'i bir daha davet etmemiz lazım diyorum. Sözü size İstanbul'a veriyorum.